Welcome to TPGI's Real People, Real Stories podcast, where you'll find interesting and diverse stories from folks working to make the world a more inclusive place.
Hey, welcome to Real People, Real Stories podcast, brought to you by TPG Interactive. I'm your host, Mark Miller, thanking you for helping us keep it accessible. Do us a favor. If you're enjoying Real People, Real Stories, share it. Tell someone about it. Hey, even link to it from your accessible website. So welcome. Thank you for listening. I want to introduce right away, first of all, Marissa, our producer. Welcome once again to the podcast. And then I also want to introduce Preston. And Preston, I'm going to let you tell the world your last name. I want to say,
right.
Is that
So,
right?
Yeah, my last name is kind of a pain. It's spelled Radtke, so it's naturally very confusing sometimes. So it's pronounced Radtke. So you're like describing a key that is radical.
That is radical.
Radtke.
Like that.
Right.
Radtke. You know,
It's-
Marissa, how you've been walking down the street and you see a key and you're like, that is a rad key.
I was
Right.
actually
Probably
thinking
happens all
before
the
like a hotkey, like on a video game. Like don't touch that. That's the rad key. That'll
actually-
you get all your power out in one like that. You can't touch that key.
Preston Hotkey is a much better sounding name than Radtke, actually.
Ooh, that sounds like
Isn't
a
it?
DJ.
You should go with that. You should
Yeah.
go with that. Maybe I should reintroduce. Welcome to the podcast. I'd like to introduce everyone to Preston Radtke.
That's right.
DJ Preston hotkey.
So, Preston, thank you for joining us, first of all, and
course.
welcome to the podcast. I want to get in right away into what you do, because I think that, you know, we have a lot of different people on this podcast, and what you do really directly relates to what TPG Interactive does. We actually help people make the websites, the web, more accessible, right? So it's a very technical, programmatic coding kind of thing. And you actually teach a class on called Introduction to IT and Web Accessibility. So can you tell us a little bit about your job? Where do you teach this class? You know,
Sure.
what made it come about and all that good
Awesome.
stuff?
Yeah, so I technically it's a part-time job. I'm a part-time lecturer at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. My full-time job is also at Rutgers as just a web accessibility specialist. But it's an undergraduate course. It's currently a special topics course, but it's in the process of being added as, you know, getting that elusive course number.
Exciting.
It is exciting. And it's traditionally populated by juniors and seniors, and it came about kind of on a whim, because when I started at Rutgers about probably 2.5 years ago, I was, you know, as an accessibility specialist, I kind of casually mentioned to my boss that I'd love to teach someday, because I had a master's degree, I had the credentials for it, but I just didn't have the experience. I was only like 24 at the time. And he said, well, you know, we do a lot of work with the ITI program. That's information technology and informatics. Got to get that right. And that's the program that my class is in. And he said, we do a lot of work with them. So, you know, they're definitely familiar with accessibility. So maybe that's something that maybe you could pitch to them and teach down the road. So a few weeks after that, my boss he also teaches them, he teaches a project management class. He orchestrated a meeting with the chair, and then I basically talked about my vision for the course. And then the preceding 2 months or so, I just worked with an instructional designer to build the course, and we are on our 5th semester right now.
Wow.
So it's
Wow.
a lot of fun.
Exciting.
That's great. So what's the feedback from the students? Like
Sure.
you know, we have like a knowledge bias, I think, here in our industry, where we really understand the importance of accessibility. We have the fortune to either be people with disabilities or be around people with disabilities. So we really are, you know, don't just understand the need, but are in the middle of it, you know, really see it. How do the students react to this? Do they come in really kind of thinking like, oh, what's this course? Or are they actually driven by kind of a desire and a need to understand web accessibility?
Yeah, so truth be told, I give my students a lot of credit for their honesty. Whenever I ask them, you know, why they took the class, 90% of them say, well, I needed to graduate, or, you know, it seemed like an easy class. So a lot of them don't really come into the course knowing much about accessibility, which is great, because it's great in one sense, that kind of a blank canvas. But the buy-in is really great, actually, and we kind of do it in a systematic way. So we split the course up into two, I'd say, overarching modules. So the first half of the course, the first module, deals with disability etiquette and kind of customer service. So we don't even touch kind of testing or remediation. We just touch on kind of the nature of disabilities, models of disability, how to interact with individuals with disabilities. Lots of exposure to assistive technologies. I have access to like screen readers and tactile graphic things like that, and they get to play with those. Their favorite class is, so I volunteer with the Seeing Eye, which is a guide dog school in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And there's a puppy raising group on campus. So one class we talk about different laws, and we also obviously talk about service dog laws and other ways that disabled or people with disabilities travel. So I actually bring in some puppy raisers from that club so the students can, it's kind of a stress relief, to be perfectly honest, but it also makes accessibility seem a bit more accessible, I guess.
Yeah.
It makes it seem less
tangible,
menacing. Yeah.
Yes.
tangible and furry.
Exactly. And that's also my favorite class too. But and then the second half, that's when we talk about actual testing and a little bit of web development and kind of how to build different accessible experiences. But the first half of the semester is meant to be easier, meant to kind of ease them in, and like just to kind of demystify what people may think of accessibility right off the bat.
So Preston, I have a question. Before I started at TPG, I'm a little ashamed to admit this, but I didn't even realize that blind people or people with low vision could really access the internet. So are your students more are they more well versed in this? Are they aware that people with disabilities use the internet, or is it kind of like
I think they're aware. They just don't know how, or they've never had to think about it before.
Yeah.
A few times when I've talked to the students about how different individuals with disabilities access the internet, it almost feels like, oh yeah, I figured they did, but I just didn't know how. So
yeah.
it's more of they know the end result. They don't know how they get there though.
Got it.
So just being a web accessibility tester, engineer, however you want to label it, is there's not a lot of you guys in the world, right? So how did you stumble upon this as a profession to begin with?
Sure. So when I was in college, I initially was for my undergrad, I was a double major in public relations and creative writing, and consequently, I took a job as kind of an alternative media conversion specialist at my school's adaptive tech lab. And then, sorry, my dog's getting in the way here. So then I decided to stick around for grad school because I was offered a graduate assistantship kind of managing that lab, and tuition was paid for, and I frankly didn't know what else to do with my life. So I went to grad school for emerging media, which actually focuses a bit more on user experience design and kind of HCI. And then while I was a graduate assistant, that's when I actually did a bit more of the testing and the auditing, as opposed to more of the file conversion. And then I liked that a lot because it seemed very altruistic. And as someone who has a disability, it was kind of a way for me to, give back, in kind of impact a community that, directly touches me. So then when I was done with grad school, I figured that I should actually, see if I can make some money in the industry. And then I landed this job at Rutgers. And then shortly after that, that's when the part-time teaching came about.
That's fantastic.
So what I want to ask you now, a lot of people may not realize this, but when we start the podcast, I have very little information on the people that we talk to, right? So I have a basic idea of what you do, but we never talked about your disability beforehand, right?
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of questions for you. Really, so I'm assuming that you have a vision disability, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And how did that come about? Is that something from birth, or was it degenerative over time?
Oh, I was born with it.
Born with it. Okay.
Yeah.
And is it, are you low vision or are you completely blind?
I guess I guess I'd be legally blind. Like I have some color contrast on the corners of my eyes, but
Okay.
I don't have enough where I could walk down the street without a cane or a service animal. I wouldn't really recognize anyone, but I can see some contrast.
Okay. And your dog is obviously one of the like a service dog.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. So and I'm asking this question because this is really interesting to me because I had a class when I was long time ago when I was in college, and it was a theater class. And there was a gentleman named Dave Richmond and a woman named Susan Goldman who taught the class. And Dave is completely blind, and he was known as a stage director, and he was actually known for how visually impactful his stage direction was, which I always found
Mhm.
really interesting. But it was a fascinating class because not only was it a great theater class, I mean, both of these people were just passionate about the theater in general, but he was very open about his disability, and I learned a lot at a young
Yeah.
age about that prepared me for things like this. So how do your students, aside from the content of the class, how do your students react when they walk into a classroom with a professor who's completely blind?
Uh,
Or
they've been pretty mature about it, I guess. Like if sometimes we're all virtual now, but when we were live, the few times I would have ask for assistance, maybe finding a plug or something, there would always be a student to kind of come up there and just help me find something. I've been very lucky. I haven't had any very disruptive students yet. I kind of flat out tell them that, first day of class, I might be like, I please don't be disruptive. Um, I obviously can't tell if you're texting or not, but if you are, I mean, you're probably gonna miss some content, so that's on you. Just do it in such a way it's not distracting to other people. And I think they just kind of appreciate that honesty. And I kind of I don't like to, highlight my disability, but I want them to feel comfortable so that they don't have to kind of tiptoe around it.
Go around it, yeah. And then, so do you find that there's a natural curiosity where you will have students come up after a class and say, hey, almost like, Marissa was talking about with I didn't realize blind people could access the internet.
Yeah.
Do you have people come up to you and say, hey, I've never met somebody who's blind before. How do you do this? How do you do that? What's this like? What's that like?
Yeah, sometimes. Not as much as I initially thought there'd be. I think that maybe because the students are shy, I don't know, or they're just very well informed. But I do get that on occasion. But typically, we do try to kind of just explain, that many people with disabilities just live and aim to live lives just like everyone else. So I think some students take that to heart and they just kind of accept that that's what happens. But certainly there have been some instances where a student may walk up to me and say, could you maybe tell me how you learn how to cut a steak or something? Or, what do you do if you're walking down the street with your cane and you find a post and there's a sign that's overhanging that you don't see or something like that. So I try to encourage questions like that.
Yeah, I think it's important because I think that the context that you give as a person with a disability supports the content of the class, especially if you have that open attitude. It's not just like, here's this theoretical subject that we're talking about. It's a subject that's particularly important to you. So what do you find is what do you find are like the sort of the most important things that when it comes to web accessibility content that the students are walking away with? Because I would imagine that you're not teaching a group of people who are going to walk away and be accessibility testers, but more people who are going to walk away and sort of remember this experience and hopefully bring it in at one degree or another.
I think probably the most resounding thing that my students come away with is just how kind of universal accessibility can be and is aimed to be. So I if you think about like the curb cut effect, many times I'll talk to them about certain accessibility features that have become adopted by the wider population, and that kind of demystifies it, makes it kind of normalizes kind of accessibility in their mind, just to make them see that in the end, people who are disabled and people who aren't use many of these same functions for their own specificities.
Right. That's interesting. So when you said curb cut effect, I knew exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Because we've used the curb cut example. I'm in the same situation you are, Preston, where I'll get on the phone with somebody quite often, and it's the first time they've really run across anything. So, I technically have disabilities, but nothing mine are all hidden, right? It's nothing as obvious as somebody with a vision disability, using a cane or having a service animal. So I'm often having to kind of explain to people how, wait a minute, accessibility benefits everyone, right?
Yeah.
That's a very difficult concept. And we use the curb cutout all the time, but I like how you actually have a full-on label for it.
Yes.
Is that your label, or is that something that somebody else, or title, I should say, the curb cut effect?
Well, I actually, it's not my label, but I think one of my colleagues at Rutgers kind of said it in passing, and so I'm in charge of delivering accessibility trainings for our team. So if someone just said it in passing to me, I kind of like that. I think I'll throw that in our training. So
yeah, I'm stealing it, by the way.
Oh, you can steal it.
I'm going to steal it and use it. I think it's a good blog article title, right? The curb cut effect.
Yeah. Something we do so I work for the marketing department along with sales with Mark. And a lot of the times we aim to position accessibility as a convenience, because if you are creating a product that is intuitive for as many people as possible to use, it's going to be very, very convenient, very easy to use for someone who doesn't have a disability. So like the curb cut is one of those things that is convenient. And just because it was intended for someone with a disability doesn't mean that it's not a great product for everyone.
Right.
So the idea is to divorce the misconception that there's an accessible product and then other products, because in actuality, they're all the same product. It's just a better product because everybody can use it.
And by the way, I'm sure the listeners are following, but just in case they aren't, when we're talking about the curb cut effect, what we're talking about is the fact that curb cuts are the areas in a sidewalk that has a small cutout and a ramp, right? Meant for a wheelchair to be able to get up. But I know when I was pushing my kids around in a stroller, I would head for the curb cut because it's much easier to get the stroller up and over it.
Exactly.
And even just a shopping cart coming out of you got a ton, or you got both.
Our luggage.
Oh, there's so many. I mean, like there's bikers, there's skateboarders, there's, when you're carrying luggage, there's so many instances where a curb cut is just so helpful. And especially
skateboarders ollie onto the curb, but
what?
I said the skateboarders just ollie onto the curb. Everybody else needs. But talking about people we were talking about people who were cool before the podcast, so that would be they're too cool for the curb.
Kind of the other thing is, even in the so for someone who may have a visual impairment or may have another kind of motor disability, kind of finding that curb cut will line them up directly with that crosswalk, so it'll prevent them from veering into the traffic or away to it.
Yeah.
Never even thought about that.
Yeah.
So speaking of the curb cut effect, right, which we've now coined, right?
Yes.
Somebody did.
You heard it here first, folks.
You heard it here first.
Curb cut effect. When it comes to web accessibility, Preston, what would your favorite curb cut effect be, or the thing that you think stands out the most as a curb cut effect when you're applying accessibility to a website?
So the first one I like to lead with is using semantic HTML or HTML5 in the sense that that your content becomes a bit more search engine optimized. Because, from a business standpoint, if you're developing something on the web, you traditionally want eyes on it, you want attention, and here you go. If you develop web content with these practices, you're not only making it possible so that maybe 10 to 15% of your user base could interact with it, but you're also potentially increasing, money or revenue to your organization or just attention.
That's a good one.
Yeah, we actually did a webinar I guess it was about a year ago, on the intersection between SEO and accessibility.
Mhm.
And in the Venn diagram, there is quite a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
So it's really, I mean, I think that Google has made great strides to ensure that an accessible experience is some of the factors they consider in the ranking.
Well, and that and the Google search engine is essentially a blind
Yeah.
user.
That's true.
Like a
Yeah.
lot of people don't think about that, but the
Yeah.
Google crawler doesn't have eyes. It relies on that same semantic structure
Yeah.
and alternative text and things like that a person
Yeah.
with a vision disability would. And I think the other, to extend your point, Preston, I think that's a great one. And one of the things for me is that I love it when people use semantic structure in a Word document.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't, right? They want
It's
to
overlooked.
make
Yeah.
a bold, larger
Exactly.
version of the font or something like that. But when you use semantic structure, the Word program itself is like a blind user, right? Now, all of a sudden, Word can look at that document and say, well, geez, here's a table of contents. Or if you want to, if you want to navigate the document, I can give you a navigable structure.
Mhm.
But if you don't have the semantic markup, then you can't do any of that.
Right.
I also think, like, one of my favorite curb cut examples is color contrast.
Mhm.
Especially now that we have responsive design, people don't realize how often proper color contrast ratios help people who maybe stepped out of their car into the bright sunlight and all of a sudden on their mobile device, that glare from the sun is reducing contrast across the board. So if you have stuff that has high contrast,
Mhm.
the person's still going to be able to utilize the, whatever the application of the program or whatever it is.
Right.
That's a big one. Or even just, like I got open windows behind me here. Eventually they're going to stream across my monitor and I'm going to have a low contrast for a second. Temporary situations that
Right.
mimic people with disabilities.
Or even I also talk a bit about closed captions.
Mm.
So even for individuals who may not have a hearing impairment at all, it's just another delivery method. Maybe they don't learn best through, maybe they absorb the content better through reading it.
Yeah.
Because there are certainly learners like that.
I actually love closed caption. I use them all the time.
Well, a lot of my
Like
friends
random stuff that I watch, like I
Netflix,
really
yeah.
love.
Yeah. People learning foreign languages will watch
Mhm.
will watch stuff in the language they're trying to learn, and they'll use the closed captions, either translated or not, to learn that. And then the famous example is that sports program that's playing in the on the other side of the bar, in the loud crowded bar.
Yeah.
You're using those closed captions, which were put there for somebody with a disability, but now you're using them to be able to consume that content in that situation. So speaking of content, I'm really curious. It sounds like you have a really interesting kind of two-part content, right? And I think that you've got in my opinion, I love your approach, because I do think that appreciating people with disabilities and better understanding people with disabilities really sets the stage for the motivation to learn the second part, which is actually how to do the coding. So how did you decide? I'm sure you can't show them everything, right? So how did you come up with your course content?
It's a good question. How did I come up with that? Honestly, it was kind of organic. It was honestly what kind of jumped to my mind when I was kind of imagining, if I had to train an intern, what did they need to know strictly for the second half of the semester? Because if it was training an intern, I wouldn't spend that long. Probably wouldn't have that much time to train them on the etiquette and all the kind of history of it all. But so I just kind of, if I was hypothetically hiring an intern, I asked myself, what were the key things that I want to teach them if they're an intern in my department at the time? So that would include kind of running some basic one-page scanners, how to look for different accessibility functions within digital documentation, and how to provide kind of measured accessibility remediations or solutions. Obviously, that's kind of dependent on the technical level of the student, because some students that are basic HTML, some of them know like JavaScript, so it kind of runs the gamut. So kind of depends on the semester.
So you said you've been running this for 5 semesters, which is fantastic. Have you had any students come back and contact you or revisit you and say, hey, you know, I took this course just on a whim, but it really has helped me out in my professional career or in my
Yeah, sort of. So this program, it's linked with our internship program actually. So
Mhm.
within, this is for my full-time job. So um, in the IT accessibility office at Rutgers, we have a team of 4 full-timers, and then each semester we have a full-time, well, not, well, a full-time intern from the department. And we don't require that they take the IT accessibility course, but you know, it becomes very evident that they have. So sometimes I'll advertise the internship in the class, and then they'll apply for it, and that's how they'll learn about it. And then they'll, because it's helping me out in the end. Also, it's helping our team. It's taking the load off of us.
Mhm.
And we've had one of our interns say that when she was applying for jobs the semester afterwards, that having that experience on her resume, both taking the class and being able to say that I was an intern within the Rutgers IT accessibility office, kind of set her apart in the field that she went into, just because there are
Great.
obviously not as many applicants kind of with that skill set.
So I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to speak, if it's all right, Preston, I'm going to speak directly to your students.
You can
Right.
speak directly to me. I'll allow it.
You'll allow it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to make sure I had permission first. There's a lot of people who can code. There's a lot of people who can do HTML out there, right? It's a great skill set. The world needs it, right? I think everybody's, there's plenty of jobs out there for those people. But when you know accessibility, the need for accessibility is getting greater and greater and greater and greater. And companies are facing bigger and bigger challenges where they have to manage and integrate accessibility into their software development lifecycle. If you can walk through the door with experience, or if your resume shows up with that experience, it's starting to become a huge differentiator out there in the market. So I think that, you might have this sort of quiet little class with its first 5 semesters out there, but it could be one of the most important things that somebody who's, wants to be anywhere really within technology department, even if you're just, if you're an accessibility SME and you're setting up the program, you don't even have to be the person doing the code. But if you have that experience, it's going to set you apart and really, it could be the difference between somebody picking you and somebody else.
Right. And
And,
they're so in demand now, especially with, everything going virtual. I mean, I don't know if you look at just job boards over the past year, there's so many more accessibility jobs that are just popping up at
Absolutely.
consulting firms, at just in-house groups. So there's a lot out there.
Yep. And people can't find the people they need for accessibility.
Yeah.
There's a deficit. So if you have the experience, or you have have that within your education, it's going to be fantastic. And I think that they should send part of their paycheck directly to you, Preston.
Well, yes, that goes without saying.
That's why you're doing it, right?
That's right. What makes you think they haven't been?
I don't know how it works, but good for you. That's excellent. Any standout stories with students or anything that you want to share before we wrap up?
Oh,
Where somebody's really kind of
students.
surprised
Yeah.
you or anything?
Not really. It is very fun to. So one of the big assignments I have them do is on their smartphone or on their Mac or PC, download or activate or utilize some accessibility function, be it changing color contrast, automated captions, whatever. A lot of them have to use screen readers, and it's a very amusing time kind of reading their response paper. And I could just like read and feel the frustration emulating from the document, being like, I tried to open my text messages and it just wouldn't do it. I finally slapped it twice and it finally opened. And then they're like, and then I realized you actually have to touch it twice. And then sometimes later on they'll say, oh, it actually says double tap. I never realized. So just kind of the different light bulb moments.
I don't suggest this for your students, Preston. In fact, if they could stop listening for just a minute while I relay this story to you, that probably would be better. But I have heard of cases where people use the screen reader function to do things like listen to text messages in class, because they can put an ear pod in their ear, and then they can, they don't have to look at their phone to navigate, right? If they get good with it, and they can actually go through and utilize their phone and read text messages and stuff like that through the screen reader, while they should be paying attention in a class.
Well, Mark, as you know, that wouldn't work because I'm blind and we have the best hearing in the world.
Oh, is that what it is? So in your class, maybe somebody else's class that might work. But
Yeah, but not here because it's part of that supernatural way about us blind people.
Yeah. The guy who actually started this podcast years and years ago, a gentleman by the name of Mike Will, he and I started this podcast back in 2013. So he's my first co-host ever. He actually used that trick. I don't know about in class or anything, but he was a accessibility engineer, right? Like yourself. But he was sighted, and he said that he used the accessibility screen reader feature on his phone to listen to messages and stuff like that, sort of undetected when in public. So
that's smart.
So there you go. Try it, just not in Preston's class.
That's right.
Yeah.
Do it any other class. I don't care. Just not mine.
Just not your class. Very good. Well, hey, thank you for jumping in. Is there anything else that you want to add before we go? I mean, I think you're doing a great service to these young folks who are coming up and preparing themselves for a.
No, I love teaching the class. It's, I love my full-time job as an accessibility specialist, but it's fun to kind of see the other side of higher education with regards to accessibility. And if there are any fellow accessibility kind of teachers out there, I'd love to, swap stories or go over techniques, because there's a lot of those for every other subject, but not accessibility. So
sounds like a forum that needs to be started.
Exactly, right.
Yeah, that's good. Any major plans for upgrading the course, or is that what you're sort of trying to work on?
Not yet. I'm still, this just involves teaching in general. I've had to iterate a bit since when I was in person. The first half of the semester was a lot more exposure based. So like we'd bring the dogs in, I'd bring in different forms of assistive technology. There tend to be more hands-on interactive. Second, since we've been virtual, it's been a bit tougher to do that. So just trying new ways, as all teachers are, to kind of, stimulate learning in the virtual environment.
Do you have them download a screen reader onto their personal systems and stuff, or?
I did this past semester. Typically, I would just have them I'd have them like partner up with someone who may have a Mac, or I try to not make them download it if they have something that's already built in.
Right.
But this past semester, I kind of required it.
Change your mind.
That's exactly.
All right.
Tougher times.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate you joining us, and keep it going. I mean, keep building the class. It really is. One of the things that we see missing is people getting this kind of information in education. There's certainly out there. I think like RIT has a program. You can find it, but it's not real common inside of this sort of curriculum pathway.
The thing that I really want to teach them is like, you can learn how to code accessibly, you can learn a lot of different accessible functions, but I think it's really important to kind of not learn to be empathetic, but to kind of be exposed to kind of the human side of accessibility and kind of see the impact, and that kind of taps into their the moral side of the students, and that kind of bridges the gap between someone who, they're aware of accessibility, they'll do it, but they may do it half-heartedly because they really don't care about it, or they don't know what to care about it. But when they see the impact that it has on people, it kind of makes them, inspires them more.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And for sure, the people who have family members or whatever, and they really understand the importance, and that's us, by the way. When I have a client who starts to make their website accessible, and it's something, an e-commerce site or something like that, it's really important to me because I have friends that rely on that. I know that my friends are now going to be able to more easily or successfully access that content, perform the tasks, make a purchase, whatever the case is. So you're absolutely right. I think that's the true bridge, is when people have empathy, and it's not hard, right? It's not hard to give them empathy if they just have a little bit of exposure.
Right.
And I think that is probably greatest value you're passing on there. And to bring it back around, that is really the value that one of the big values I got out of my course when I was in college had nothing to do with accessibility, but it was just taught by somebody who was blind. And I got to experience another human being that just interacted with the world around them in a way that was different than I did. And I got to understand that better. And it was fantastic. So,
Of course.
thank you. And you don't have to put yourself out there like that. You know, it's not a requirement. So I think you're doing a great thing. It's fantastic that you're willing to stand up and teach people and share yourself that way with them.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So thank you for joining us, Preston. Really appreciate it. We're gonna wrap things up. Thank you everyone for listening. This is Mark Miller, thanking Preston, Marissa, and reminding you to keep it accessible.
This podcast has been brought to you by TPGI, the experts in digital accessibility. Stay tuned for more Real People, Real Stories podcasts coming soon.